a mnemonic device, which is to pick out some easily differentiable attribute from that occasion or that experience or that item of information and connect it with something you know very well. And you would think that this would now overload the memory because now you have to learn something else. But the point is you are attacking something that's hard or confusing for you to remember to something that is clear and well stored. And then once you get it to, that helps.
When I was learning to spell geography and arithmetic, a whole gang of kids were having this problem, and so we spelled geography. George Eastman's old grandmother rode a pig home yesterday, and arithmetic was a rat in the house may eat Tom's ice cream. And the bad thing about that is that I never write it without saying it. So
That's right.
And I wasted more time learning
the mnemonic device
than I should learn the word.
But once you got it, you don't make the mistake.
Yeah.
You may take more time, but you get it. One of the examples that George Miller gives about the necessity for chunking and organization for memory is that he says, I'm going to give you a sequence of letters. Let's see. He said, remember, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters. He said, I want you background that you know very well. Now, if I wanted to make it absolutely certain, and we could demonstrate this, I could come back in the fall, and by something I'm going to ask you to do now would make sure you remember this. I want you all now to look at this and frown. Okay, I fixed it. It went definitely from short-term memory into long-term memory. And there would be very high recall in 3 months if I came back and said, do you remember I gave you a list of 5 words, or 5 letters, and I want you to tell me what they are and the order they were in, left to right. Of course, you would write them right to left, but then you would have them left to right. And because I gave you the objective organization, I connected it to something you already knew, and then I gave you a psychomotor experience attached to it, namely, actually frowning. You will remember it without any trouble. That's why the psychomotor component in the life of a child is very important. Whenever you can get a child moving, this will increase the probability of that experience being stored. This is even true for adults. Anytime you move from a passive modality of learning to an active one, where the large muscles are being moved, this increases the likelihood, of storage. Yes, Ruth?
When a couple of years ago I was trying very hard to dig Anisa, this is exactly what I did with DIG for
differentiation, integration, and generalization. Yes.
That was the way I
remembered those. Yeah. There's an interesting study, let me report very quickly, about moving muscles. There were 3 groups of people randomly organized so that you control them for all these unknown variables. And they were all asked to read some material comparing communism with democracies, with democratic form of government. One group had to read just silently, and they took a written test afterwards on the information. The next group had to read out loud, which means you not only hear the voice, but you have the experience of moving the lips. The third group had to not only speak out loud, but at certain points in the text, they had to do certain gestures, like this, or like this, or whatever. And then they all took a written test afterwards. And they all did about the same. 4 months later, they all took the same test. Those who read silently remembered the least. Those who read out loud remembered the next best, and those who read out loud and did the gestures with it remembered the most. So there have been quite a few studies about that now. For people working with young children, it simply says, get the kids moving, off the rear ends and doing things, and you increase the probability of memory. Now I want to very quickly go down these things. The amount remembered after 2 weeks has a fair chance of lingering permanently. In other words, if you can keep something around for 2 weeks, you got it. And now if you put a good retrieval cue on it, that means to say you attach it to something else that was around for 2 weeks, then you build. So that's about a good period for rehearsal and review. A lot of rehearsal early, intensive review at the beginning, and then tapering off, but keep it going for 2 weeks, kids will have it. Here's one that other people will be reluctant to try, but talking to yourself while doing mental work usually provides a better recall. Now, if somebody's watching you, of course, they think you're losing your marbles, so you have to do this in private.
Does it work if you verbalize it, not making any noise?
Yeah, it even helps if you just move your lips.
Yeah, reading is from.
I know. Well, that's because if you've got 500 people crammed in a library and they're all talking to themselves.
No, but I mean just the lip noise.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason that is it slows down speed. See? But there is not all that much virtue in a lot of speed reading. Although people who speed read use semantic devices for storing things in memory, and that's quicker. And that's a whole nother issue, but it's an important one. If you're doing very complicated material that's unfamiliar with you, you cannot speed anyway. So you might as well verbalize it out loud. And then later, when you come across that same stuff, once you know it very well, you can speed over it. If you anticipate the use of something that you're doing now, anticipate the use of information that you're getting at one point, that will help get it stored properly. That's what you were talking about, Dick. If you knew that you're going to have to use it this afternoon by repeating the lecture to somebody else, that anticipated use of it keeps attention alive and keeps you on it. Now this, you can see how, as a teacher then, as you're guiding the child's interaction with certain environments, if in the part of that guidance you indicate what its use is going to be later, and then you actually build in a use for it later, this will facilitate the building up of the memory. Now, if you promise that you're going to use it later and they never use it later, then you build in a credibility gap. So you have to make sure that the kid uses it later in some way, shape, or form. A lot of things that kids have to do, they don't have to use right away, and therefore there's a problem with it. Memorization is facilitated by spacing out the reactions over the course of time. Stop when you're tired or bored. Use idle moments or waiting periods during the day to react a few more times and go over in your mind the material. Fatigue lowers reactivity. It may take 20% longer to memorize something at 7 p.m. than it would have taken at 9 a.m. Memory needs to warm up, especially when you're talking about complicated material. So you should take a little time to get yourself warmed up with the material by rehearsing it a little bit. Here's an interesting one. If you just pretend that you're interested in something, it increases the likelihood that you will remember it. In other words, if you have to go something you know you're bored with already, and you say to yourself, well, I'll just pretend I'm interested, it actually facilitates memory. Let me see. The more fully you react to experience, the better the chance of recall. The reaction is more likely to be adequate for remembering when we react several times, react for a long time, react with personal interest, and glean some meaning from the experience. React actively to the experience you want to remember. Look, listen, talk, think about it at the time that it occurs. Alcohol, loss of sleep, and disease all lower, even the common cold, all lower the level of reactivity and therefore create an inadequate response for future memory. It's that adequate response that gets it from short-term memory into long-term memory, and that's why children need a chance to make that active response. Ambiguous memories are the easiest to distort. Spend time doing critical thinking to make what you need to remember clear and accurate in the beginning. That's why we say clarity of first examples is absolutely mandatory for a child. Make sure that that first experience is clear and unambiguous. If it's confused and messed up, then you've got all kinds of things to undo. Well, that kind of gives you a quick summary of the memory stuff. If you would simply take the notes you have taken today, and as you are planning an experience for a child, go down the list and say, what can I do to increase the likelihood of this being remembered by applying one of these things, you can literally affect the chances of it being remembered and increasing the probability of it being stored in a way that is more easily retrieved. Okay, see you at... So I very quickly want you in 3 minutes to write down all the things you saw this morning out there. You just did it? Yes, we'll turn it over. Well, if you just did it, just keep it. Without referring to the list that you already made, of course. You can't make reference to the old list. This has to be a fresh piece of paper now.
Just what we had on the original list?
No, no, no. Just everything that you now know is out there. Yep. No, we don't wait until, we don't need to go until remembering. And then when you discuss what people forgot or didn't get right, it's worthwhile. It does really help fix it in memory and increase it. Okay, this afternoon we're going to talk about the self. But before I do that, I want to just make 2 points about memory, about forgetting, as related to confusion. There are 2 kinds of forces at work. Well, there are lots of things. I just want to mention 2 of them. One is called proactive inhibition. And one is called retroactive inhibition. Proactive inhibition is the case where what you're learning now is inhibited by what you already know. In other words, there is a confusion between something you're trying to assimilate now with something you already know. And when you are analyzing a child's difficulty in remembering something or learning something, it very often is the case of proactive inhibition. Retroactive inhibition is the case where what you're learning now is messing up what you already knew, or what you already know, or it's interfering with, in some way, with what you already know. And patterns of forgetting are often tied in with these 2 kinds of inhibition, proactive and retroactive inhibition. One other point, that I want to make, I have a little note on it here, about forgetting. I have it nicely phrased in one of my papers here. And that's the point, that the method of storage may actually interfere with retrieval. And largely those are methods which introduce a confusion right at the time of storage. And it happens frequently because you don't understand that's what's going on, and it only comes out a little bit later. This will often occur when, in the case of reading, when there are two rules that operate at different levels, in which, if you see them at the same level, seem contradictory and therefore introduce all kinds of confusions. In the case of reading, of course, it's already set up to be confusing because one letter may represent many different sounds, and one sound can be represented by many different letters. That's why the research shows that if you give the child a learning set which makes him believe that there's a one-to-one correspondence between letter and sound, that as a learning set now causes things to be stored in a way that are going to interfere with retrieval, because it's not true. It's much better to have exceptions right at the beginning and let the child get a learning set that accommodates the idea that more than one sound can be represented by one letter, and many letters can represent the same sound. And when you come to analyze the errors that a child is making, you may find that the error is really a memory error, where something got stored and the way it got stored interfered with its retrieval in some way, shape, or form. Well, any questions about memory at the moment? I didn't go into pathological memories like agnosias, aphasias, and general amnesias of various kind, but there are many, many very interesting kinds of memory deficiencies related to pathology rather than just normal forgetting. Another thing you might be interested in is that as aging takes place, the more recent things go first, so that you might forget the person you had lunch with last week, but you would remember your grandmother's purple dress or whatever. So as senescence sets in, and you talk with old people, you know how true this is. There is a return to childhood in more ways than one, and largely it is caused by the way in which memory fades. You remember the earlier things longer, and the later experiences go quicker, and therefore that return to childhood movement is largely connected with that phenomenon. You simply don't remember things that occurred later because of organic deficiencies and so on.
What age are you talking about?
Well, anytime after 26. No. I was telling Don and Pat and Mag that I called my mother over the weekend and asked her how she was, and she sounded a lot older than I thought she should sound. And of course, one always tends to remember one's mother at an earlier age, particularly if you've been away from home for a long time. And she said, well, I'm getting older faster. And I asked her what the evidence of this was, and she said, well, she felt a little stiff when she got out of bed. I thought, well, I get stiff if I sit in a chair for 20 minutes, but she also said that her memory was going, that she couldn't remember things. But she said, but I remember that I didn't remember them. And so at least I'm not blaming other people or for my own deficiencies. And it's true, she tries to recall somebody's name. And she said, oh, you know who I mean. About every 3 phrases, she just substitutes with that kind of a thing. And I remember when I was growing up, she used to try to remember one of our names. I have 5 brothers and a couple sisters. She nearly always ran the whole roll call, particularly if she was in a hurry and tense, you see, and often got the dog in there as well. That was the thing that sort of put us off. The dog was almost always in the list. So, now I want to introduce a complex topic. Did you have your hand up? No. Namely, the idea of identity formation and a clear definition of what we mean by that, and its relationship to general education as we're defining it in the model. As you know, we have organized the general idea of potentiality into actuality as a phenomenon being sustained by interaction with the environment. And that as these potentialities are actualized, what was a latent power now becomes a manifest one, namely in the form of a patterned use of energy. And in fact, a process is we define as that structural alteration in the head that enables you to use energy in a patterned way. And it might be in a patterned way to feel, in a patterned way to think, in a patterned way to perceive, in a patterned way to intend something, or in a patterned movement of the muscles. As you interact with these three different kinds of environments, which have been categorized according to the ontological levels of Whitehead, you get a structure of that energy use into patterns, which we call values. And we said there were material values, and social values, and religious values. And that when you put all these together in a sum total, they represent the structural and functional reality of personal identity. Now, given that as a beginning point, I want to make a number of elaborations on that and maybe talk a little bit about our own theory of rehabilitation for delinquents and how delinquency starts and is sustained, and therapy for those who are mentally ill, and a definition of mental illness based on this idea. We define a value as a relatively enduring structuring or structure of, or a relatively enduring pattern in the use of energy. The thing that makes it relatively enduring is that it's hard to change it. Now, let's take that rather abstract definition and compare it to the layman's definition as a value is something you believe in strongly. Would that be a fair characterization of a layman's? If you ask an ordinary person, what are your values? And they got to talking about it, and you said, well, what is a value? Don't you think most people say, well, a value are what people think that they believe in and is worth a great deal, and so on. At least that's, the literature reports the general notion of value to be something like that. And if you read people like Benjamin Bloom and his different taxonomies, when you look at his taxonomy of the affective domain, you see that he puts valuing almost entirely in that domain. In fact, we were so mystified by Bloom's taxonomy of the affective domain because he doesn't even mention any emotions. There's no rage, love, jealousy, hatred, anxiety, envy, just none of those things are mentioned in Bloom's taxonomy. Emotions aren't mentioned at all, so it seemed very weird to us. Well, the Bloom taxonomy and a number of other taxonomies dealing with the emotions spill over into the idea of values. But here's what we found when we started reading in depth the literature on values. Most people would start off talking about values in terms of emotions so that you would see that there was an affective aspect to it. But very soon people would say that a value predisposes one to a certain kind of action, so that there is always a psychomotor element. Then they said, of course, it influences how you perceive things. So there's always a perceptual component. Then it says it determines what your intentions are, or your intentions are somehow implicated in this, so that there's volition there. And of course the value has to be about something. I mean, one's thinking about it. You don't hold the value without some thought. And so there's always a cognitive element. When you put all of that vast literature on values together, you cannot do it without seeing that there are affective, psychomotor, perceptual, volitional, and cognitive aspects to the value phenomenon. So we finally came to this abstract definition of a value as a relatively enduring patterned use of energy through these 5 modalities, integrated and influenced by the environment in which you're interacting with, which helps structure it, also influenced by the symbol system used to influence it, and also influenced by the content or the information that you have assimilated about the world in which you live. And that, in fact, if you have assimilated a lot of error or falsehoods about the world in which you live, this will have a bearing on how you use your energy. And it will mean, in essence, that the energy use places you slightly out of touch with reality, or very much out of touch with reality. And the more you're out of touch with reality, the more you fill in the gaps with fantasy, and the more you do this, the more neurotic you become, until there's a certain point when you really move into a psychotic world, into a complete fantasy world, then you're labeled psychotic. Well, you know this old story about the psychiatrist, that a neurotic builds castles in the sky. The psychotic moves into the castles, and the psychiatrist collects the rent. So it's a very lucrative business, because building materials are very inexpensive, and besides, the patient builds the edifices himself, and so it's not too hard to collect the rent on it. When you try to understand in ultimate terms, in some way, shape, or form, Socrates' admonition to know thyself, what do you come up with? That old piece of advice has been re-emphasized down through the ages. You find it in all the great religious writers or prophets. You find it in great philosophers like Confucius and so on. They've all said, know thyself. Now, are we to presume that they mean that when you peek in a mirror, you can recognize yourself? No. We think they mean a lot more than that, because nowadays you can cut your hair, let it grow long, or you can put a wig on, and there are no ends of things you can, accoutrements that can be added to the physical body to change its shape, form, color, whatever. So they must mean something more fundamental and basic when they say know thyself. To us, in the Anisa-Model, to know thyself means to know how you use your energy. And to have represented in consciousness, symbolically, a record of, an analysis of, and therefore an awareness of, whenever you want it, of how your energy is being used. And the strongest patterns are those that are the most enduring because they resist extinction, but also because you spend a greater amount of time and or a greater amount of energy in whatever it might be. Now, that really comes down to being something not terribly different from what the ordinary layman means when he says about somebody's values. Because if you think something is worth a great deal and you really believe in it, then you invest energy in activities, in thoughts, in feelings, in thinking, in action related to that thing. We are generally aware, as just human beings, that it doesn't take too much energy to say something. And therefore, what a person says is not really the best indicator of his values, because he may be a liar. And if he spends a lot of time lying, then lying is a value for him. In other words, I'm not here addressing the idea of a good versus evil as a value. Some values are good and some are not so good, depending on whatever criteria you wish to apply to make the judgment. But if you use a lot of energy in a definite pattern that is hard to extinguish, then that's going to be a value and it will define you. Now, we've seen in the last few years among political figures that it's well known that what they say is not what they do. And it does take very much energy to talk. But it does take an awful lot of energy to do some things. Now, people build in conflicts in their values, and it is when conflicts emerge that you begin to have pathology, which I'm going to get into in just a moment. But before I do, I would like to have a reasonable assurance from you all that what I've said this far is making sense. Now, somebody said to me the other day, it was Sue Thoreau's husband, as a matter of fact, when we were out, he said, well, every day I tie my shoes, so that's a relatively enduring pattern of energy use. But is that a value? I said, well, yes, but probably not a terribly critical one, but we could tell how much of a value it is for you by asking you not to tie them anymore and see how you react. Well, I could immediately see that he isn't going to tolerate that. So that tying his shoes turns out to be more important than he might have thought. But it's probably more important than he would like to have thought initially, not because of just tying his shoes, but because tying shoes belongs to a broader category of energy use, which you might call being tidy. And therefore, that value of being tidy will have lots of little subparts, and whenever you try to chip away at a subpart that relates to the whole, there will be resistance. So if I would say to him, I want you for the next 10 months to go to your work with your hair tousled, your shirt tail out, and no tie, and your pants unzipped and your shoes untied, he would say, nothing doing. Because that would cut at and hit at a very strong pattern use of energy. And when you see him, you know right away by being with him. Developing new patterns. Largely by becoming a competent teacher of his own self. In other words, if we define teaching as arranging environments and guiding the child's interaction with it, as you mature as a competent learner, you then come to the point where you teach yourself whatever you need to know. You arrange your own environments and guide your own interaction with those environments. Now, if you have an experience of several years which makes you a competent learner, it means as you grow older, you will always introduce yourself to new environments. You will make certain that there is a continual introduction of novelty into your life, because that introduction of novelty causes you to form and extend the patterns by which you use your energy, which means you are perpetually growing and developing as a human being, and therefore progressively changing. On the converse is also true. You can train a child or teach a child in such a way that he comes to use his energies in such a way that he will not introduce himself to any new environments, nor will he try any new interactions with any environment, including his old one, such that he has settled into a routine and therefore does not change. He stagnates. And in one sense, the rate of the actualization of his potentialities just kind of drops down to zero, practically. And that's what happens to most people, as a matter of fact. And if they become something different, it's usually because it's forced on them. Now, this introduces a broader psychological understanding of the function of tests and difficulties and heartache and disappointment in our lives. They can be turned into assets and rather than liabilities, because every great disappointment or hardship or trauma or difficulty usually is related to an alteration in the environment with which you must interact. It has been an unwelcome introduction of novelty into your personal life space and circumstances. And here's an opportunity now to find a way of using your energies that will consolidate some parts of you and actually make a stronger, better human being out of you. For this reason, we do not think that kids can be reared in a hothouse atmosphere. Contrary to what some people have thought about Anisa, that because we believe in kindness and courtesy and politeness and decency and all those things, and that we don't think you should let one child beat up another child and bloody his nose and so on, that we are raising children in a hothouse environment. No, there will be plenty of conflicts and tensions within the normal situation to expose children to a sufficient range of emotional stress or emotional delights to enable them to be familiar with them, to differentiate and integrate them well so that they're put together pretty well emotionally. The emphasis in Anisa on having the child do it for himself is the chief antidote against growing up in a hothouse environment. As soon as a child is able to do something for himself, he should be encouraged to do it. In our child rearing programs, in our programs we're using for training parents how to raise children, that's one of the #1 axioms. As soon as the child can wash the dishes, put him to work. Even if it takes longer for him to wash them than it does for you. As soon as he can make his bed, he should be taught how to, and he should do it. As soon as he can dress himself, make him do it. As soon as he can help cook, have him do it. All through his growing up period, whatever chores and interactions with the environment are possible within that domestic setting, as soon as he is able to do it, he should be doing it. And if you, as a parent, insist on doing it for him, you are depriving him of interacting with environments in ways that strengthen his competence and his sense of effectiveness. And it will degenerate very quickly into laziness, which is, well, I don't want to use any energy, let alone not fuss about the pattern. I don't want to even use any. See? And lazy people become their worst enemies, their own worst enemies. And as you'll see, one of the key features in pathology, where mental illness is concerned, is when the organism's use of energy turns out to do the organism in. That's, in a sense, the basic definition of pathology. Now, if by knowing thyself we mean knowing consciously how one's energy is used, when you want to get to know somebody else, the same set of rules apply. If you want to get to know somebody well, and this is true of the good judges of character, they analyze quickly how the person uses the energy available to them. And that's how you make the best judgment, because that's who the person is. He is the sum total of his patterns by which his energy uses. Now, if you're a person that uses a lot of energy frowning, I mean, it takes energy, psychomotor energy, to frown all the time. And if you're grumpy, which is one form of patterned use of energy, well, people pick up that as a part of a pattern of his personality. Some people use a perpetual stream of criticism, and so they build a lot of their lives around that, and for them it is a value in the way we are defining it, and it defines their identity. You cannot think of that person without that being a part of the way they are, because the way you are is really synonymous with how you use your energy. If you're kind and polite and pleasant, and helpful and nice and generous, and open and sweet and kind and humorous, then people, and you use energies, obviously, to be called that, you must put energies into those behaviors and those thoughts and feelings and perceptions and so on, that we call those things. And they are your values, and you come to know them as that. Now, if you come to know somebody basically on the base of visual cues, namely how they look, and you want to build a relationship on that, watch out, because it won't work. Now, this is precisely why Hollywood has done us in. They have tried to tell the last several generations that to fall in love with somebody is to be visually attractive. And that's why we spend so much time kind of keeping our appearance the way we do. Now, there has been such a rebellion against the falsity of that as a value, as a value worth pursuing, that the younger generation has turned against it, and I see just a counter trend, which I would call a will to ugliness, visual ugliness. They just deliberately set out to look as ugly as they can. And that's very sad, because if beauty is the teleology of the universe, you know, we'd like to kind of be in touch with the crest of the wave of evolution, you see. Well, I don't know what that meant, but I won't interpret it publicly, yes, sir. Well, we therefore have in the model for the upper age levels what you might call a set of educational experiences which gives another person the practice of coming to know himself That's why we have meditation in this system. We haven't introduced this in Suffield schools yet. It'll be a while before we get that together. But one of the functions of meditation is to contemplate the self, to understand how it uses its energy, and then to see whether or not the patterned use of the energy of the organism now, in fact, will enable you to approach the ideal self that you have projected for yourself. We talked about that the other day, and I'll go into that a little bit more. The point I want to make here is that if you want to be reasonably happily married, then you need to know who it is you're getting married to. That is to say, you must have a fairly accurate assessment of the identity of the person you're going to take up the rest of your life with. And if you use your energies in a pattern like this, and you marry somebody who uses their energies like that, chances are there will be conflicting and incompatible uses of energy such that it would be hard to live in the same household for very long. It is possible for people who use their energies in diametrically opposed ways to be visually attracted to one another or sexually attracted to one another. And if they then jump into the marriage on that basis, the marriage will be on the rocks during the honeymoon. Well, it's true. That's why we don't advocate honeymoons. They're so expensive, too. You see, what happens is that in the American dating system, you can conceal the way you use the bulk of your energy and have on display during the time of the date a different pattern of energy use which fits. See, but you can't keep up that all the time, not the real you. So that on the honeymoon, when you're together 24 hours a day, the real patterns come out. You see? I mean, you might keep it up for 24 hours, but after that, it's just too fatiguing to be a phony self, you see. The real truth wills out. And so that's when people realize they made the mistake. This is after 72 hours. Unless they have really come to know one another because they understood how the patterns of energy define the self. Now, if you didn't go on the honeymoon, but you just kept your jobs and went to work, you could get to know each other more gently, and you could come to learn new things, which would mean modification of those pattern uses of energy. And then after 5 years, you take your honeymoon. It's a glorious success. Because by that time, you have modified, what'd you say? I didn't say a 5-year honeymoon. I said after 5 years. Never mind.
Or 10 or 15 years of work.
10 or 15 years is better even, yes. In America, well, the Chinese have a good view of marriage. They say that marriage should be like putting a cold pot on a hot stove. It gets better and better and better, warms up over time indefinitely. The American version is putting a hot pot on a cold stove. It's just downhill all the way. Because there's nothing to keep it warmed up, you see. The pot just cools off. And by the end of the honeymoon, it's really lukewarm, if not a few chilly cold shoulders as well. Well, it's always struck me as strange that one of the most critical decisions in one's life is marriage. And because it influences the next generation, and it also influences what kind of life you're going to have, largely. And that given the critical nature, therefore, of the decision for oneself, the next generation, and therefore for society, that we wouldn't take some care to train some people about the whole affair. But it's left up, like parenthood, pretty much to chance, or to Hollywood. And Hollywood has produced a very effective negative model. You can say to yourself, whatever Hollywood says is good and true about marriage, if you do exactly the opposite, chances are you'll be better off. That's a little bit harsh, but perhaps not too harsh. It would be therefore possible, and we've thought a good deal about it, of organizing a training program for unmarried persons who are thinking of getting married, so that they go into this operation knowing what it entails, and that they are equipped then to make the judgments all along the way that will be helpful and good. And then we would have a marriage counseling operation based on the same theories for those who had already gotten themselves into the pickle and now want to try to do something about it. Now let me turn my attention a little bit to two other points. One which relates to the prerequisites of a normal personality, or the formation of a normal, healthy, good identity. And the second, a set of comments on alcohol. And people who spend a lot of time drinking alcohol, it becomes for them a value. That is to say, it is a relatively enduring pattern use of energy. They go buy it, they take the cork off, and they drink it. And they come to know themselves then as alcoholics. The problem in giving alcohol up then is that they don't know who they would be. Quite literally. You can't just be a nothing. So before you can give up a former self, you've got to have an idea of what the new self ought to be in a way that you can start rehearsing new patterned uses of energy. This is true of almost any pathology. It is sensed as the identity of the person. A person who feels himself to be no good and useless, and who has rehearsed his conscious knowledge of himself as a worthless person as he defines it, doesn't want to become a worthwhile person, because that's new and strange. He wouldn't know himself. And therefore, we prefer to remain the same as we are. Studies show, for instance, for people who are enormously obese and who want to lose weight, that even when they lose lots of it, they still perceive themselves as big. They have a little machine, you know, with a couple of knobs, and they put the photograph of the person in the machine, and but turning the knobs, you can make yourself fat without getting shorter, or you can make yourself thinner without getting taller. Usually, when you distort a picture, you have to stretch it this way to make the person thinner. But with this machine, it doesn't. You can make yourself exactly as you think you are. And so they put your picture in as you are right now, and they turn the knobs so there's distortion, and they ask the person to turn the knobs now to make the visual appearance be exactly the way they think they are now. And the fat people always make themselves fatter than they are. They can tell. They know where the knobs have to be turned to be exactly the same as the photograph itself. In other words, neutral. And psychological tests have shown this time and time again, that people hang on to who they are, even if who they are isn't very good, or they've got some things in there they wish they could change. Now, each one of us has a list of things we wish that we would do differently. We wish that we would stop using our energies in some ways and use them in other ways. And we all have that kind of pressure. And yet, we have come to be somewhat comfortable with the things we don't like about ourselves, such that we would not want to trade our pack of troubles for somebody else's pack of troubles, no matter how bad our troubles are. Now, there does come a point for many people that they come to hate themselves so much they wish they were anybody else but themselves. And that's when you now spill over into pathological situation. Well, One of the definitive prerequisites to mental health in the way we are defining it is the formation of, fairly early on, of a self-ideal. And this comes about because there is an unknown that you have to relate to, namely, what you will be like in the future. Facing unknowns is a very critical part of the model and has tremendous implications for education. Your future, in precise terms, is unknown. The most common way of dealing with an unknown is to make a set of assumptions about it and then proceed. The best psychological means of dealing with this basic unknown in one's life, namely the nature of one's future, another way of saying that is, what kinds of potentialities will be actualized? What will the patterns look like 10 years down the pike? The best way of dealing with that unknown is to project the most perfect you that you can imagine. When you are able to do that, and that projected ideal self is feasible, then it provides you with a purpose in life, and therefore the chief means of structuring the use of your energy at the present time. Now, let us consider for a moment what happens when you don't have that self-ideal there. If there is no self-ideal, there is no sense of future. If there is no sense of future, what do you use to make a decision about the energy use in the present? Well, there will be two basic things: pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. The organism that pursues pleasure and avoids pain in terms of immediate experience will be one that precludes ever getting anywhere where he wants to go. Because to actualize a self-ideal is to persevere through extraordinary obstacles. And requires patience and ability to interpret pain and disappointment and delay and all these things. You won't do it otherwise. I think I told you when I was working with my upward bound students, I would get them job after job after job. And they would hold these jobs from one day to a couple of weeks, and that's about it. They'd stay up late one night, and therefore, because they don't have any sense of themselves in the future, if when they woke up in the morning, they felt tired and fatigued, and just didn't feel like getting up, then they'd go back to sleep. Well, they'd be 4 hours late to work. Well, this would make the boss mad, so the boss would chew them out. Well, that's a painful experience, so the way to deal with that is just to leave the scene. Or, on the challenge of the moment, poke the boss in the nose and then leave the scene. Which makes it even more difficult to come back and pick up where you left off. But if you, say, had, as one of those students, the idea that yourself in the future is going to be a citizen in a community whose professional life is medicine, then you have a reason for getting up on time and getting off to work even though you don't feel like it. You have a reason for taking a few chewings out from your boss, and you'll probably be polite and kind to him because that smooths things over and keeps energies from being used in ways that disturbs human relationships. And you are able to hang in there. You know how to deal with obstacles. And if the job gets too bad, you will, before you leave it, make arrangements to get another. These kids I worked with never did that. They always left the job and then worried about getting another some other time. So it became pretty clear to us in analyzing this issue that the prerequisite to a healthy, wholesome life is a self-ideal that is realistic and feasible but yet far enough away that there's challenge. Now that self-ideal may strongly figure in a life's work, like a research scientist, or it may center around largely just the notion of social compassion, or it may be, I'm going to be the best parent, and that's the main element in my identity. In which case, of course, the patterned use of energy that defines the self will have major patterns and major amounts of energies going into those patterns, which define, in terms of your self-ideal, what you mean by a good parent. See? Now, most people's self-ideal has lots of things woven into it, in terms of good citizen, good parent, good spouse, good son, good businesswoman, good whatever, good teacher. And that, of course, immediately brings up the question of good, and therefore the question of evil. And we're not going to have a chance to go into that into great length. You know, those are subjects that have been discussed for centuries and centuries and centuries. But we are inevitably social creatures, and therefore we will have social values because we are biologically made to be social. Because when we pop out of the womb, and my wife says nobody pops out of the womb, that's a male chauvinistic interpretation of the birth process. So I once told her that if she would relax, the baby would pop out. And after she had the first baby, she was very cross with me. And she said, the baby did not pop out. And I said, well, that was because you didn't relax. And that made it worse. Well, I know better. We were just being facetious. The point is that from the very beginning moments after birth, children begin interacting with an environment. And the quality of those interactions and the nature of those environments begin building up structures in the head that begin to define the patterned uses of energy. A baby, when he's first born, doesn't have much of an identity. You don't see much of a character on day one. But it's amazing how soon the identity begins to emerge. And the thing that makes you recognize your baby as your baby is because of those patterned uses of energy that become to be associated with him characteristically. The idea of the model is to make certain that those basic patterns are patterns in which the use of energy keeps the organism within touch with the reality of the environment in which he is thriving, so that he becomes perpetually in charge of himself and in charge of that environment, and always in the context of perpetually actualizing his potentialities until the day he dies. Yes?
What if,
I want to have a discussion on the nature of planning in a very general way, indicate how an understanding of the nature of planning can be applied to one's personal circumstances in one's own personal life as well as in the professional life, for managing efficiently the responsibility that attaches to the job that you were hired to carry out. And to talk with you a little bit about our long-range plans. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but just so you get a sense of the broad picture under which we're working. And then after the coffee break, involve you in some planning in small groups, which this afternoon we'll provide some feedback on. After I talk for a little while, I thought we would open things to a question and answer period that would not only be about planning, but the relationship of planning to all the things that we've already discussed, and have Don and Sue come up here and join me for more of an informal exchange, and they're be held responsible for filling in any gaps that I've left here. Does everybody know Sue Thoreau? Yes, this is another one of our staff members, Dr. Susan Thoreau. This is everybody. You have a chance maybe to get to know Sue a little bit during your coffee break. I want to express many perspectives on planning that have been presented by a lot of different administrative theorists mostly, but placing it squarely in the theoretical context of the model. A plan always relates to a future, and a future is always unknown. So planning really fits into basically that part of the model where people are trying to deal with unknowns. And in a very real sense, because we say that the only way you can deal with unknowns is to do it on faith, and this is why we say that out of that evolves religious values. The fact that a man plans is one of the chief defining characteristics of his nature as a spiritual being in Whiteheadian terms, as opposed to a material being, because if we were entirely material beings, subject only to efficient causes, we wouldn't do anything about the future. We'd just sit and wait until something happens to us, and that makes us do it. We wouldn't have to worry about the future at all if you were only concerned with efficient causes. But we never are as human beings. We are purposeful. And to be purposeful means to be concerned with the future. So planning is one of the chief characteristics of man as a species. Makes him different from all other creatures. And it is the means by which we escape the tyranny of efficient causes. If you are not a planner at all, then people around you will do the planning for you. And you'll just be buffeted around by what this person wants and that person wants, and this pressure here and that pressure here and this demand here, this opposition here and this obstacle there, and you'll just kind of be buffeted around and take the path of least resistance. But if you plan, then you have a rational scheme for exerting an influence on the future. I think it's pretty clear that the difference between a planner and a non-planner on the rate of actualization of potentiality is rather striking. A plan is the most effective influence on the actualization of potential, whether it's a personal plan or a plan of an organization to do something. For a very simple reason. When you come right down to it, a plan is a design for using energy. And therefore, if you don't have a plan, energy will get used in 20 million different ways. And many of those ways may be at cross purposes, in which case you've got a little pathology in the system, whether it's an individual personality as a system or a social organization like a school as a system. When energy is used at cross purposes or wasted, when it gets too far, then there is a condition of pathology that sets in. I think you will have picked up in the course of our time together the Anisa perspective on reality, which claims that process is what reality is all about, and that you cannot talk about process without considering patterned uses of energy or expressions of energy. Our endeavor to find ultimate first principles on which everything rests forced us always to push farther and farther back until we got the absolute bedrock of things. And what it comes down to is energy in its expression. So a plan, then, in the broadest possible context, is an expression of faith in which you organize things such that a hypothetical future is brought into being. In fact, planning is to hypothesize the future. Now, in the absence of that, as an individual person, you will go the path of least resistance. You'll pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and that'll be that. But there won't be too much growth in the Anisa sense of the translation of potentiality into actuality. The same thing is true of a system. If a system does not plan, then it will just tread water, stagnate, even regress. But the potentialities of the system itself will not be actualized. Now, just as the actualization of potentiality in a given human being rests on their ability to differentiate, integrate, and generalize experience through 5 modalities, the potentialities of a system like a school or a classroom within the school depends upon the way that system is differentiated and integrated. In other words, the way it's differentiated and integrated in terms of staff organization, so that there is an organizational plan which depends upon staff differentiation and integration to actualize the potentialities of the system as a whole. If there is no differentiation, there will be very little actualization of the system's potentiality. It will stay the same year after year after year. And if the system is serving children very well, there could be worse things than that. The only problem is that because society is changing so rapidly, if the school system doesn't change right along with it, then children will be prepared not for living in the real world as it is, but their little degrees and their little certificates and diplomas right on up to the PhD will all be an accumulation of certificates of endurance on the one hand and certificates of obsolescence on the other. It says the bearer of this certificate put up with a lot of nonsense. The bearer of this certificate is out of touch with the times and obsolete, and therefore he'll have to get a lot of on-the-job training in order to keep up. Well, that's probably going to be true in any case. But we've known in vocational schools, for instance, they cannot, like modern business, keep changing the equipment. So if you go to a vocational school in auto mechanics, you're going to be working on 1938 Chevys because they can't afford to have the latest engine every year. That's why it is silly not to integrate the education of the young people of the community with the community and what's going on there, because that's the only place you can actually be up to date, is right out there where it's happening. And schools are going to be, in our opinion, ultimately going to have to affect that integration because it's too expensive otherwise. You learn how to type on an old 1932 Royal, but the minute you get into a business office, you're going to be working with an IBM STST, MCST. Well, you just have to learn how to do it all over again when you get there. See, it doesn't make any sense. So, I want to with that as a kind of a general background, give you a little overview of our long-range plans, which won't take just but a few minutes to know where you fit into. Then I want to talk about some specific perspectives on the act of planning itself that will be useful to you as people who belong to a system that's trying to actualize the potentialities of children. And then later, we want to break into small groups where you begin doing some planning that may be useful in the fall, which takes into consideration all this information, or some of this information that we've been discussing this week. You've heard us say time and time again that we have 20 years of research on the drawing boards. Well, it may be 50. I was just looking at it this morning. In fact, this is the master Anisa plan, the Anisa master plan for its own destiny and future, which on the one hand entails a perpetual refining and updating of the model, because the model itself is a general theoretical guideline for influencing the future, and therefore it in itself is a kind of plan. All theories are plans of sorts, and they're, in a sense, the best kinds of plans because you can operate under them in an extraordinarily flexible way, thereby taking into consideration everything that's happening at the moment. Other kinds of plans, which I don't think work terribly well in educational system, are sort of recipe-type plans, which don't admit of that flexibility. And if you can't take advantage of the situation and the children and all of the conditions that are at hand. So the model itself and the refining of it is a major effort that we see in the future. In order to do this operation well, our long-range plans call for, in the center of operations, an implementation of the model itself. Because until we have a fully developed staff, administration, parents, specialists, teachers, so on, all working on the basis of the model, we will never see the power of the system to actualize the potentiality of children. This implementation includes working with parents to be a year prior to conception and to train the parents to work with the babies on day one. At 6 months, they begin coming into the center for specialized, maybe hour or 2 hours a day, so that by the time they come to the preschool, just as soon as they're toilet trained, then they will just start going on through the system. This system will go up to initially age 8 is the first bite we're taking off. Age 8 because the development of the speech centers in the brain are pretty well organized and consolidated by age 8. And then we are going to build it on up to age 15. And if things go well after that, we will then begin projecting the plans for an Anisa University that begins with children at age 15. Because we think by the time they come through this model, they'll be ready for advanced graduate study by the age of 15, simply by virtue of having been kept on the cutting edge of their development and not having had to hold up and wait for everybody else. And then when they got ready, everybody else wasn't ready. When everybody else is ready, they wasn't ready, so that everybody is held back. That's what the ultimate effect of a non-individualized system is everybody gets held back because nobody else is ready when anybody else is ready. This implementation of this model, because of our emphasis on interaction with the environment, also includes the establishment of a model facility in which the location of the ceilings and the floors and the walls and the doors and the johns and the sinks and the outlets and the storage places and the hallways, everything is organized according to the theory of development. In other words, rather than letting architects plan the facility, they will be consultants to developmental psychologists on our own team. And we will decide where all those things should be on the basis of what children require and the teachers who are working with the children require to facilitate the growth and development of those children at an optimum rate. We did a little preliminary study, at least we have enough put together now that when we get ready to do that, we'll get ourselves a grant and move, and we've had some positive indications from Educational Facilities Labs, which is a subsidiary of the Ford Foundation in New York. They've come up to see us a couple of times. They say, when you get the land and you get ready to move, then we'll provide you with some architectural consultants. And they're very interested in this notion of translating the propositions of a theory of development into the specifications for an educational facility, which makes sense, of course. So many buildings are designed, and the children aren't even mentioned. Only occasion. If you have very tiny children, they will usually say, well, we better make the toilets smaller. But that's about it. And they didn't even used to do that. These poor little kids had to come up and sort of chin themselves on the stool to get up on top of it, you know. If you put a videotape camera on wheels at the eye level of a preschool child and wheel it around in an ordinary preschool to see what that child's eye usually sees, it's a rather depressing situation in many ways. It's always the undersides of legs and tables, the undersides of people's chins, their knees and their belt buckles, and there are doorknobs that hit them in the teeth, and windows that are just too high to peek out of. See, everything is just in the wrong scale. Now, there has to be a way to coordinate the scale so that adults don't feel like they're walking around in a dollhouse the whole day, but on the other hand, things ought to be such that a child is feeling relatively comfortable moving around, and I think we can make the combination so that everybody will be happy in the environment. But we know that, for instance, a rotational movement of a child for turning on and off a faucet is difficult movement to execute because there's not enough strength there. So you need a different kind of water faucet that has a lever where you can turn it on and turn it off, so you need a faucet that's got a long handle on it. Well, there are just many things like this, where you put the doorknobs, what kinds of faucets are needed. See, doors are tremendous hazards in schools for young children. First of all, they're too heavy. A child just is taking his life in his own hands trying to get through some of these doors in our schools, you know. So we want to look at the whole issue of redesigning entranceways and exits for the sake of children. You see, those doorknobs should not be hitting them in the teeth. And we are very concerned about lighting and variations in lighting to fit certain kinds of needs, and the ability to vary the lighting within a given room, not by just turning some of the lights out, but by lowering all of the lights a certain way. We know how many lumens per square foot are required to do a visual discrimination exercise. In some of these Head Start centers, where they have 40-watt bulbs high in the ceiling, these kids couldn't do a decent visual discrimination exercise if they had to, because if they're using colors, there's not enough light to activate all the cones. You simply can't make the discrimination. Well, so the model implementation there also includes the construction of a new facility. Now, planning a school for the future, if you really think you're going to plan a school for the year 2000 and beyond, then you have to think in terms of mankind as a species and where you think he's heading, because otherwise you'll be planning a facility that doesn't connect with anything. And if you look at world trends, you will see certain areas of great need for mankind, and therefore things ought to be built into the earliest curriculum that helps to prepare people to manage those needs and those difficulties. And since the number of famines and difficulties are projected agriculturally for the next 500 years, more people are going to have to be concerned about this. And the whole issue of ecology and the plant life of the earth has got to be given some serious attention. It has direct implications for nutrition. And if Feingold's work now is anywhere near in the right direction, we're going to have to find other ways of getting more natural foods, because the 3,500 chemical compounds put in food as additives now is giving people no end of fits. And there is no way to test all of those chemicals and see which ones are affecting which people in what ways, because you'd be 922 years old by the time they finished doing all the tests, and your arms would just be filled with holes, and yet he's found the minute he takes a child who's having a variety of difficulties, all associated with his catch-all syndrome, minimal brain dysfunction, when he takes them off those foods that have those, that 85 to 95% of the children immediately get better within 48 hours. And we've now had a chance to interview lots of mothers whose children have been on the Feingold diet, and they say it's just dramatic, the change. And they say, furthermore, if we put them back on ordinary foods with all those additives, within 24 hours, they're climbing the wall. In fact, one lady that Sue and I talked with in Denver a couple of weeks ago, she said that she put her child, who was really up and around the wall and driving everybody else up the wall too, put the child on the Feingold diet, and within 48 hours, she went from a devil to an angel. And then she was invited to a birthday party where they had all kinds of candies with artificial flavors and colors, and ice cream, which had never seen a cow before, but was whipped vegetable oils with artificial flavors and artificial colorings and artificial additives and preservatives and everything. You can tell real ice cream. When real ice cream melts, it melts down into cream. Most of the ice cream you buy in the store now, when it melts, it just turns into a spongy mass that more or less holds the same shape of the carton that it was in. And it's very light. You're buying frozen bubbles, mostly, filled with artificial flavors and colors. And she said that right after this child would start eating all this stuff, right on the occasion of the birthday party itself, she turned back into the devil by the time the party was over, just that soon. And so I just had to take her home and dry her out, as it were, by putting her taking her off the drugs, as it were. And you'll see now more and more, because there's a drive on for companies to label foods no artificial colors or flavors. Now, preservatives are another issue. We have to use the preservatives now because it's probably better off to have a little bit of artificial, some preservatives, than it is to eat rotten food. But even there, we have to have some new answers. All of that discussion was by way of saying that in the Anisa facilities for children, there will be greenhouses. And there will be a strong curriculum in botany right from the preschool times. These children are going to learn about plants and photosynthesis and soil fertilization and so on, so that when the world needs those kinds of specialists, there will be children around who love it and who have a good background in it and can go right into it, because it's going to become a very sophisticated operation. And ultimately, the same thing is going to be true with harvesting the sea, because just eating a few whales and a few tuna and so on is the least possibilities of the tremendous resource the ocean is. And we're working on lots of things like developing enzymes that you can drink, which would enable you then to break down cellulose and get the protein out of it. You see, a cow eats all that grass and turns into that wonderful beef and milk. But what happens to you if you eat a bale of grass? Well, you'll be extraordinarily constipated, for one thing, because the body doesn't have the enzymes to break down cellulose. Now, if we could get the enzyme artificially produced so that you could drink it along with the grass salad, then when push came to shove, you could just have a big feast every time you mow your lawn. And this would cut down the grocery bill, to say the least. Well, we have tried to look at long-range needs of mankind as a species. Take the energy crisis, that's another area. We're going to have to know some things about that. Now, if we don't start alerting our children right at the beginning of where we're heading and what the needs are, then of course they grow up insensitive to them and they think that somebody else will take care of it. They think President Ford or somebody else. It'll be a let George do it universe. And you know, George doesn't exist, and the universe just winds down because nobody's prepared to take it. And we think it's important for children to become sensitive to those long-range needs. So they have to be reflected in the facilities that we're planning. Now, there are lots of things that center around this. First of all, there is research and development section, which relates to that. That means we collect information from all of that, all of that's going on with those children, with the teachers, so that we have some scientific basis for determining how we're going to improve the preparation of teachers, and we're going to find out exactly what specifications executed in what ways are more effective in actualizing the potentialities of the children in all of those 5 categories of potentialities. We're also going to take a long, hard look at what things in the content curriculum are not preparing children for living in the year 2000 and beyond, and just get rid of it. Some decisions have got to be made about the information overload. There is no way all that information can be given to children. So that's why we think the shift has to be away from content anyway to process, so that the child knows what and knows how to think, because the whats of thinking will change. I was just reading in the book that Pataba gave me the other day, where it said that in 10 years the knowledge of all disciplines will have doubled. Well, when you think that all that knowledge that has accumulated over the last 2,000 years up to now in a given discipline, that now in 10 years is going to double, what does that say about the next 10 years? Well, you can see it's getting out of hand very rapidly. So we need to teach children to identify the broad general picture of how he fits into the universe, and to prepare himself to be the best learner that he can. Because if he is a competent learner, a master learner, then everything else will fall in place. And this research and development operation is designed to let us know whether or not what we're doing is getting it where we thought it was taking us, as efficiently as we wanted it to be, so that we can perpetually update it and refine it. That means moving ultimately the Court of Appeal for educators to a scientific court, where the question is, did it work or didn't it? And if it didn't, why didn't it? And if it did, why did it? Rather than having the ultimate Court of Appeal as it is now, which is simply tradition. What did we do before? Let's do that now. And you don't even ask the question whether it worked, or if it worked, or why it worked. See? In other words, change must have a direction. And if you don't get in charge of the direction, then conditions will worsen, very probably, and then you may not have too much say over the direction. You'll just be swept along with the wave, you see. Then there's going to be a section of educational personnel preparation. We will have the training programs for master teachers, for assistant teachers, and for that entire battery of specialists, multi-art specialists, math specialists, specialists in psycholinguistics, and the diagnosticians, the curriculum specialists, the health specialists, nutrition specialists, and so on, learning disability specialists, which will be auxiliary personnel that bring very high levels of specialized knowledge to diagnostic and prescriptive supports for the teaching act in general. And we will prepare teachers in the center. As to say, every teacher, every full-time teacher working with the children will always have with her, some working day after day after day, somebody who is in preparation and taking a degree. In other words, we don't think you can really prepare educational personnel in a university if you don't have the children. And that the basic place to learn how to work with children is working with those children under the supervision of somebody who is an expert in working with children. And that the system we have now is inoperative. It's just that we haven't recognized it yet. So there will be educational personnel being prepared right in the center. Then there's going to be another place which is going to be, will be attached to that, which will be satellite operations. These will be public schools that want to systematically switch to the Anisa-Model over a 10 to 12-year period. And that switch will come through primarily in-service training operation, where a team of people trained by the central operation will be on a 5-year loan, for a fee, of course, to a satellite site, where they will work themselves out of a job over a 5-year period by replacing themselves with people within the system who have the potential for becoming the staff development specialists in the system. And then we hope ultimately to offer degree programs right in the school system so that the personnel in the school system can carry on their degree work for certification purposes and so on without stepping outside the school they're in, except occasionally to visit the center and see the operation and do some observations and so on. So we hope to have a satellite operation as well. Then, so that's going to be public schools. Then there's going to be another kind of satellite operation on schools of ed, where a school of education of a university might say, we want to switch to the Anisa system. But you've got the problem of retraining all those professors, which has got to be the worst job. It may not be possible, as a matter of fact, because you know how professors are. So, but there will be some. We've already had a number of people contacted. Yes, Dick?
Do you see Anisa as being a model amongst models, or do you see it as an ultimate model?
I don't think it can ever be an ultimate model because there will be alternative perspectives. But this model will always be one that has built into it the capacity for remaining on the forefront of the most progressive thought. So people can take their choice. They can either be the most progressive or they can be less progressive. We're going to make it hard for them to make a decision to go another route.
Well, for example, the reason I say that is because I sent you that article where they were doing some models out in Chicago, I'm not sure just where, but so that there would be a national geographical location in the nation where one could go see
different models, huh?
Different models, kind of like a supermarket approach to model viewing. And I was just wondering whether
well, I mean, whether we would be invited to set up shop there to exemplify Anisa or not would remain to be seen. But our own impression in looking at the 22 models which have been identified in one way, shape, or form as models is that none of them have ever identified the first principles on which they operate, nor do they have a comprehensive theory that shows how administration, research, development, teaching, curriculum, evaluation hang together in some coherent fashion, and how all that gets connected with the community and the destiny of mankind based on the extrapolation of the trends of the development of the species. I just don't... Did you ever hear Bank Street doing that, or no? And that's no particular criticism of them. It's just that the broad basis of this model is going to make it hard to compete with, but it's also going to make it more difficult for it to get accepted because it's more costly. See? People prefer to have things in tiny doses and somewhat fragmented and so on because it's a little bit overwhelming, see. But yet, the selling point is that the power of something lies in its comprehensiveness and its coherence. And that, I think, is what is reflected in the model. And we've already, for instance, the Oregon College of Education invited us out a couple of years ago, and they said, well, we wouldn't necessarily want to turn our whole school of education into Anisa, but we'd like to start an Anisa training program there. And then over time, let the students who come to the school select whether they want the Anisa program or the non-Anisa program, and if more and more want the Anisa program, then the other one just over a 20-year period fades. See? And so we don't mind competing in the open market in that way. In fact, I think that's a sensible way to go. Provide a competing program and let the students themselves decide which way they want to go.
Is that what you're doing now at UMass?
That's right.
so that you do have a nucleus now of students coming into your undergraduate program.
That's right. But we're not, we're not anywhere in that. We don't have this going. And so Suffield substitutes for that, because this is where the students will come to get their practical experience under the supervision of some teachers who know something about the preparation they've had, because it's all been on the same theoretical basis, see. But then, again, that's not adequate, because in Suffield we didn't have a chance to work with parents and get the babies started right. So by the time you get the babies, 50% of their destiny has already been unfolded. If you can buy Bloom's statement, that 50% of the variability in the IQ of a person at age 17 is already determined by the age of 4. And, that's an awful lot that takes place in those early years. And by the time you get these children, a lot of the basic patterns are already set. Well, there's going to be another training program for school committees, school boards. There's also going to be seminars for state departments of education. Now, school boards don't think they need any training, but we've seen them in operation. And you have people making policy decisions who know less about it than the people for whom they're making the decisions. From an administrative point of view, it's very difficult. On the other hand, you need boards directing the affairs of the community, otherwise you lose a democratic element, which is fairly important. But can you imagine a medical clinic being organized by a lay board who said, well, I don't know anything about appendicitis, but I don't think this guy's got appendicitis. I want you to cut off his left leg instead. I mean, that's just about what, that analogy is not too far stretched. We have school boards making the wildest decisions that make no sense whatever. And they are incompetent, ignorant, and in some cases even malevolently motivated. And the reason they ran for the school board had nothing to do with a desire to help children. It had to do with an expression of sometimes a relatively ugly ego. And I have never met a school board in which I felt everybody campaigned to get on that board so that they could bring new resources together to help children grow and develop at an optimal rate. They got on to reduce the taxes or whatever else. Yes?
Have you looked into the compatibility of Anisa with different political systems and which are feasible?
We find that there are none compatible. We may not survive, right? We have to operate under the constraints of whatever system we're in. And of course, it always comes down to a conflict or a disagreement. And then when the decision is made, you have to live within that decision the best way you can. But all we would feel is an obligation to politely make the principle clear that when a decision is taken that flies in the face of the model, that now this decision undermines, in our view, the achievement of purpose in the most effective way, namely the actualization of the potentialities of the children.
But this is bothering, and has bothered me. Isn't there a critical point at which you as a group are going to have to be, by necessity, say, we can no longer operate. The ecological mass is now mitigating against the model to such a degree we can't implement?
Well, there's no such thing as a black and white distinction between implementation and non-implementation. It's all on a very broad continuum.
But ultimately, there must be.
Well, we would like to push it in the direction of full implementation all the time. And I think that, you see, if we start over here, which is just partial implementation, and in some fields we have partial implementation for a variety of reasons. Because the grant you would need to fully implement it would be in the millions, and it would take 20 years to really fully do it, because you've got to have the integration within the community. So you start over here, and you push in the direction of full implementation, and the way you do that is accumulate incontrovertible evidence that what you're doing is getting where you want to go, and if people then really want to go in that direction, they begin to make decisions that make it possible. But I suppose I'll probably die in here somewhere, and maybe it'll get carried on, you see. But I would love to get over here before I die, but I somehow feel myself to be 195 before that's going to happen.
Well, but if a community, for example, can accept, say, 3 of the 7 first principles,
Yes.
then where are you in terms of implementing? For example,
At 3 principles.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Which isn't terribly effective, but it may be slightly better than what they have.
Okay, so you're willing to go for whatever better than was is.
Reluctantly willing.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for the digression, but it's kind of been bothering me as
well.
What critical mass
If it bothers you, guess what it does to us?
makes the model go? I mean, I'm just talking in terms of implementation strategies. At what point won't it go? See, when you withdraw the resource and consultants, will it sustain itself? And I think that's
only if, you see, we don't think it can ultimately sustain itself unless there is a connection between this school out here, where is it, the public school, and a staff development corps that's got a connection with us, so they have access to all this information over time. And this is too expensive. I mean, this costs millions and millions and millions. There's no way Suffield is going to set up its own research and development operation and finance it locally. It just takes millions. That's why the advantage is in having it in some central place where it's set up in an ideal way. Then dozens and dozens of schools can have access to this information through in-service training through the staff development agencies, you see. Yes.
I can't see, ultimately how you're going to be able to stay out of politics, if that must be the way that you're going to have to go to get the resources that you need. Have you any plans for that particular phase?
We have no political ambitions.
Well,
no.
I mean, only insofar as, to get people who are sympathetic to how you feel in a position to do something about it.
Well, here's our problem. The amount of time and energy and money it takes to become involved in politics to do these things means that you now don't have any energy to keep the model itself developing and going. And, but of course, everything that you try to do in a community is political on some dimension, because it affects people, and it affects public funds and public destinies. And so therefore, it's always political in that sense. But we would like the model to operate in terms of its own set of propositions and beliefs, assumptions, theories. And that is taking the Whitehead notion of the ideal as a lure. So we would like the model to function as an ideal educational system which lures and attracts people. And I think ultimately that's what will happen. We have no intention of trying to insist on anybody having this model. I mean, the thought of trying to do that is just so against anything we just wouldn't do it. Don?
But a big step in the direction of facilitating funding for efforts like this would be for an informed public to start getting after its elected representatives to change some of the systems by which they fund whatever. When the nation was crying out for a cure for polio, they would not have supported a funding effort that would have given every little clinic $10,000 to $15,000 to try to, they see that as being absolutely ludicrous. On the other hand, the public will support taking millions of dollars and just spreading it all over the place for education. And politicians who will fund efforts, who will compromise themselves by promising spectacular results within 6 or 8 months, and who will then take reports, which are basically public relations documents, back to those people and say, look, wasn't it wonderful? We got this money to do this, when everybody knows that nothing really came of it and that the money was just squandered. You see, we don't have the same attitude about the funding of education that we have about mental health, or let's not say that, that we have about health and
farm animals.
That's right, farm animals and the whole space program. You think of the amount of money that's been consumed by the space effort. You know, what they spend on one missile, just one missile,
Would put us in business.
would put us in orbit for years. So we're trying to influence people in political positions to be concerned about that, and indirectly that will help us.
And we've had remarkable indications along those lines. For instance, Mayor Bradley in Los Angeles has hosted meetings in his chambers in Los Angeles. Mag went once, made a presentation. I went once, and deans of 12 schools of education in the Los Angeles area came. A battery of principals and superintendents in the Los Angeles school system came, the curriculum specialists represented from the State Department. We were invited down to Washington. We gave a 3-hour presentation on Anisa to the Division of Compensatory Education, which is the division of the U.S. office that gives $1.5 billion annually through Title I. We were invited down and gave a 3-hour presentation on Anisa to the entire federal staff of the Office of Child Development, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So we have done a lot of spade work, so we're not just kind of sitting out there hoping that divine providence will enlighten all politicians to allocate some funds for Anisa, because we know the universe just isn't set up in that way, and that we have to be concerned with people who have power and who can allocate funds. But in terms of organizing campaigns of a direct political nature, I somehow don't see us getting into that. Now, we might convince Dick Lincoln to become mayor of a town somewhere where he is ex officio president of the school board.
That's one of my ambitions, just so.
Okay. Let us know when you're ready, Dick, and we'll come around. But we have been around, we've made presentations to about 50,000 people now in the United States on Anisa. And we have extensive letters and from a variety of people of support and so on, which is all part of the evidence that we're building for moving ahead. And it's a great worry to us. We've been down to Washington times. Mag, you wanted to say something?
Well, when he raised the political question, I think it's a very good one. And I think one of the indirect ways we operate is, for example, this week, or these past 2 weeks we've been here with you, I think if politicians, as such, would spend the time to really find out about educational systems and models and so on, such as this, that might be an influential way to get some help, or maybe parent groups or whatever. And I think just indirectly is the only way we can go at it, because even when we were in Washington, senators have a little office as big as this desk here area, and you just stand, and they can't know what Anisa is in 10 minutes, or even 3 hours. You make a 3-hour presentation on Anisa. There's no way, as you, I'm sure, can testify from this week, the past week, that they're going to know what it is. They'll just have a little, you know, a little impression, and for the most part, they say, well, it's so idealistic, it couldn't happen anyway, and they, you know, just kind of pass it off. So we are up against that kind of thing in terms of getting people to listen long enough to internalize what it is we're about. That is a problem.
Well, we went down to visit, we were invited to, Don and I were invited to visit one of the representatives from Massachusetts. And he was a very willing and receptive personality. But when we arrived at his office for an appointment, we couldn't see him right away. And finally we got in about 20 minutes later than we thought. And you know, in these offices, in the senators and representatives' office in Washington, that they each have a big clock. It's got lights around the clock and buzzers. And every 20 seconds, a light is flashing or a buzzer goes off that says the House is about to vote, you have 10 minutes to get there, or there's a caucus going, or something is coming out of committee or something. Well, that buzzer and those lights went off, I don't know, how many times did you say, Don? And every time in the middle arc we say, Anisa refers to the actualization buzz of potentiality light, and he said, excuse me, and he jumps out and says something to the secretary, he said, now where were we? And so we start all over again. Well, finally, we just left after 15 minutes of buzzes and lights, and this guy going in and
The
out.
latest of which was the bill, the House had failed to override the president's
Veto
failure or
on the
veto.
job allocation bill.
And he was the congressman from the Lowell area where unemployment was
18% or something, and therefore he had been working hard. And he was trying to hear about Anisa, why he was trying to rally the political sports to get this bill passed, and it didn't pass, and so they were all in a frenetic state. And the phone rang every 2 minutes. He'd grab the phone and say, yes, George, we got to beat those bastards next time. What about him? Well, you know, we thought, you know, we'd have to get this guy off in the Martha's vineyard for 2 weeks before he could wind down and then could listen, you see. So anyway, we're trying.
Now, how did you get the appointment? Did he call you and ask you to come, or did you have... I'm interested in...
Well, we have a network of contacts. Lois Abel's son worked in his office as a congressional aide, and that's how we made the contact. Just like you took us to Houghton Mifflin and set us up with that appointment. So you see, everybody knows somebody else, and if you believe the fundamental ontological principle of the model, that everything is connected to everything else, eventually you get to know somebody who knows the president through 922 relatives, but if you can just follow it up, eventually you get there. Now, if any of you here happen to know a millionaire intimately, during the coffee break, we'd like to talk with you. We do have some plans. I just had a telephone call last night from somebody who is very interested in Anisa and wants to call together a group of people that he thinks might be interested in Anisa, all people who have money. And I'm very enthusiastic about it, but I never put all my eggs in that basket because I've been that route a dozen times. And people are reluctant to part with their money for the sake of a long-range plan, the ultimate fruition of which won't occur in their lifetimes. People are only interested in doing that as they approach 95 and realize they can't take it with them. And then, so we need to find about 100 people who are at about age 95, each of whom has $500 million, and now they know they can't take it with them and they'd like to put it in some worthy cause, rather than setting up a trust fund for their goldfish, or their cat or something. It's just billions of dollars in this country left to goldfish and cats. It's pretty amazing. But the children know. When we were in Iowa, Sue and Don and I were in Iowa. No, Sue wasn't there. It was Leela and Larry and Don and I went to Iowa for a whole week's workshop for the Iowa Association for the Education of Young Children. And they were in something of a state because they had all been participating in getting some legislation organized for passage by the Iowa State Legislature, which was to license daycare centers for children. And they pointed out that puppy farms have been licensed for a long time. In other words, there's legislation designed to protect the health and the actualization of the potentialities of puppies, but not children, see. So the values of the society, the patterns by which we use our energies as a collectivity, shows kind of where we are in this regard. Well, we're going to have an information dissemination unit over here, where people can come. There will be publications, all these kinds of things. There will be a computerized information storage and retrieval system, because the information we're collecting is too much for one mind to recall. And ultimately, we would see computerized terminals within the public schools working with us as satellites, where a good deal of this information can be made available on a direct printout basis or on a television screen. certain aspects, so that you can check every day and see what's the latest thing being stored and have access to it. Of course, there will be people paid in these public schools that do practically nothing except keep on top of things and disseminate those things to the people who are working with the children. We then have an engineering lab that I was telling you about the other day, where if you want a special piece of educational equipment or a game that you thought of, you can bring it to the engineering specialist who will then design the game. If you're inventing a new musical instrument, or if you want to create some materials, some basic materials, whereby children may create their own instruments, you can design the parts, which would be the differentiated elements. And the children then put the elements, once they understand the principles of sound and acoustics, they can put those elements together to make up their own instruments. They can determine the range of pitches of those instruments, whether it be wind instruments, string instruments, percussion instruments, or whatever. And you simply take that plan down to these engineers, and they get together and crank out the stuff. And now you have what you need. Then, along with this, is a materials evaluation division, where we not only carefully evaluate the materials we produce to see whether or not they're getting where we want to go, but a school system over here is thinking of ordering a set of materials and would like them evaluated. They could ask this division to have a look at the materials and tell them on the basis of actual research that they've done, or from a theoretical perspective, which of these two sets of materials would be best for the kids. Out of which ones would you get the most educational mileage, you see? We'll have a special resources library, because ordinary libraries are not set up really to house the kinds of materials that you need for training teachers in the education of young children, because what we need are varieties of environment to sample in the form of different materials, mostly manipulable materials, and libraries are not set up with bins and booths and things to look at those and examine them, you see. So we need a system of organizing kits of materials where people can check out the whole kit in relatively well-organized, attractively done-up portable units where you can take home and check out a set of materials and look at them and then bring them back. Ordinary libraries aren't set up to do that, so we have to have something like that. That sort of gives you an idea of what our long-range plans are. This document here also specifies budgets and says where we'll be by 1981 or 1985 if we start tomorrow on this, and that all the budgets are in here of how much it will cost, what the staffing patterns look like. See, if you look on Appendix B, it says model implementation, 24 master teachers, 24 assistants, 2 diagnosticians, 2 language and reading specialists, 5 multi-art specialists, 2 media technologists, 1 dietitian and nutrition specialist, 2 family school liaison specialists, 2 learning disability specialists, a psychomotor specialist, perceptual, 2 cognitive, 1 affective, 6 curriculum specialists, 10 secretaries, 1 administrator, 2 assistant administrators, and 3 support staff members. See, plus the price tag, $1,378. Which is out of date now because of inflation. You have to multiply by 20. Well, anyway, yes.
Can you go into how an individual school is set up?
Well, we will have organized a system for engaging any public school that wants to take on the Anisa-Model over time, where you figure in the variables of the current level of training of the personnel, community variables, facilities variables, budget variables, because no 2 systems will be alike. So you have to have a general planning scheme to do that, so that you're individualizing, as it were, the services to a given public school system or school board or school of education or State Department of Education, all in accordance with the model. And we have a lot of that worked out in a general way. What people most often want is the whole thing spelled out for them, but it can never be done because this kind of thing is always in process. what you want to know are the general elements of planning from a theoretical point of view, and then the people there must be in charge of their own destinies to decide in what way this model is going to be taken on. It's a little bit like when you give a performance and you're going to play something of Chopin. Well, Chopin has written the notes, but you have to play the notes, and you have to decide how fast you're going to go, when you're going to go up, and therefore there is a large element of your interpretation of the general Chopin, see. So, nobody else is going to come in and play the Chopin. You can't get Chopin to come in and play his own composition for you. You know, you must study his composition, and then you play it. And you play it in terms of the piano you have and the audience you're going to be performing to, and so on. Well, that gives you an idea of where we stand, and we feel that the experience in Suffield has been, will be, an important critical step in the direction of realizing those long-range goals, because repeatedly people, after they hear the model, say, will it work? Or what experience do you have with it in the field? And we say, well, we do have experience with it in the field, but just as you know as well as I know, that the amount of money that it would take for us to be down here with you in the classrooms, working 5 or 6 of us on a daily basis, which would be ideal, we've been very, very far from being able to achieve that. And of course there's a difference in the outcome from that. But even so, I think that remarkable things have taken place in Suffield, in changing and picking up whole new directions. And that has been so significant in my view that it warrants now a careful examination of the long-range plans by responsible public agencies. And that's what we're trying to get to happen. And next year I think is going to be a fairly critical one for us in a wide variety of ways. Because we have to, since the staff at UMass is a soft money staff, by and large, we have to find the money to keep everybody together. And you see, every time we lose somebody we've trained, for instance, we have Pat Conway. See, we had to let Pat Conway go, we had to let Linda... What? Then we'd like to entertain some questions about not only planning, but how everything that you have listened to thus far can fit into that planning in terms of what faces you as teachers in the Suffield system in the fall. Obviously, there's no point in investing the time in being here listening to all this if now it didn't have a bearing upon the pattern by which you use your energies as a teacher in this system. It's a waste of time to put in time to have new information if that new information does not have a bearing upon your personal use of energy as a professional. Well, let me talk about some basic elements of planning, and then we'll just join in a general discussion. First of all, planning itself has to be planned. And this is where people often make a mistake. They don't set any preliminary plans for the planning itself, and therefore it's expected to happen by itself, but it won't. The quality of a planning session is determined by some preliminary plans for that session, and this is almost never granted. And what happens is, of course, you call people together for the planning session, and you will find it doesn't get off the ground very well because it hasn't been planned for.